There are a bunch of really good walkthroughs that tell you how to set up and create keys or credentials for creating a program to use by a program that wants to update or read or get access to Google Docs or Google Sheets or something else in your Google Drive. And those walkthroughs are great, but I really didn't get a picture when I went through them of what I was actually doing. And so here's the picture of kind of what we're actually doing. And I'm going to try and do this in under a couple minutes. The goal here is to implement a program that basically can update a document. And to do that, in the purple part, we're looking at purple. The program updates a document. To do that, it needs to authenticate a key, which means we need to be able to get a key somehow to add to the API. And it turns out that key represents an identity. They actually call these credentials, but they're essentially identities. And that identity that key represents actually needs to have permission on the document. And it turns out the way you do that in Google Drive is the simplest way to do it is just give an email address permission. And so what we need is some kind of identity. In this case, we're going to use a non-person service account that has a synthetic email address, which is awesome because we can give that right permission to the document. And then if we can generate keys for that service account, we can, in what turns out it's JSON, if we can generate a JSON key for that, have the Identity Access Management System generate a key tied to that account, we can take that JSON key, add it to our program, and that will identify us as that service account. I'll talk a little bit about service accounts in a minute. And if that service account has permissions, we can update the document. So then what's a service account? It turns out a service account is a non-person account. When we write a program, we don't want to use a human-based account. We want an account not bound to a person. So if that person leaves the company or we lose the email address or the credentials to the service account, that person isn't impacted. Obviously, they leave the company, they're impacted, but we'd rather programs not just randomly stop running because some person left the company. So basically, we use computer accounts or service accounts. So the question is, how do we do that? It turns out the credentials management system actually has the ability to create a service account. And you look at it, the service account actually needs to have access to the document, and it needs to have a role that lets it call the API, because really when you run your program sitting on your server somewhere in the cloud or on your laptop or something, you're actually calling a Google API to write the document, right? It's not like you're dragging it in the file system by hand. So it calls an API, and it turns out that service account needs to have access to the API, and that's usually done by giving it a role. And the service account gets a default role. That role gives it access to the APIs, and the permissions we put on the document give the service account access to the document, right? So there's kind of a pass-through credentials. I have access to the API, my credentials kind of pass through, and they're validated against the document. So that means I need to have access to the APIs. Well, it turns out by default, the way you do that is you create a project and you enable different APIs or services on that project, and that's so that you can create little partitioned areas that only have access to certain Google capabilities. And if you lose control of that area, it doesn't actually give them access to everything, right? So if I only gave them access to Google Drive, they wouldn't have access to Meet, they wouldn't have access to analytics, they wouldn't have access to my AI system. So the goal is least privilege, right? We want to create a project with the smallest amount of privilege required, and we give it the APIs that it needs. And then we create service account credentials that are inside that, bound to that project, and we give them the roles to give them access to what the minimum thing they need to do. And then the email address that's bound to documents, we take the keys for that account and we give it to the program to give it to, and the whole thing loops together. And all the grayed out ones are areas we're not using. We're not using human credentials here, and we're not using API keys. We could use API keys in some cases, but really service account or service principals, if you're an Active Directory, would be the way to go for this. So that's it. When you actually go through and set up and get a JSON key to talk to a program, you've actually really done all this behind the scene. Have a great day.